He's a man of many talents with a day job as a public servant, a Ph.D. in literature. He's also a playwright and an author. Siphiwo Mahala's latest book, Red Apple Dreams, hits the shelves this month. Described as a blend of fresh and classic stories, it retraces his literary journey over nearly 2 decades. Dr. Siphiwo Mahala joins us now to talk a little bit more about this. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Evening, and thanks for having me.
I was quite intrigued about, and I'm assuming that's where the title comes from, Red Apple. Is it that incident that you described with your grandmother of her pulling out an apple from her bag?
Yeah, actually, it's the whole book is dedicated to my mother, who passed away in 1986, which is 33 years ago. And so the story Red Apple Dreams was written on the 30th anniversary of her passing in 2016. So Red Apple Dreams basically, or rather the red apple itself, has become a symbol that represents the image of my mother. Yeah.
But you grew up with your grandmother.
I grew up partly with my grandmother, who brought me up and who remains one of the greatest storytellers I've ever come across.
And I was intrigued when you're talking about how she would tell her stories. You talk about her sewing a pillowcase. Please just take our viewers through that, because I find it very interesting the way you describe it and how it led to your interest and passion for storytelling, for literature.
Yeah. My grandmother made pillows. Making a pillow, she would take a sack and stuff it with old clothes and then stitch it. And then when she has to wash it after a while, she'll have to unstitch that sack and then take out, the various items out of the sack. And with each item, she's able to tell a story. So that's how... the tradition or the culture of storytelling I learned from her, and it also really impacted me in my love of simple storytelling, like you would find in works like Ken Temper's. If you think of his most famous story, The Suit, for instance, a suit is just a piece of cloth, but Ken Temper was able to tell a story that would last for decades just out of that item.
And you mentioned some books that you like. I mean, I think a lot of us who are readers, Chimamanda Ngozi's Adichie's That Thing Around Your Neck. You also talk about Say You're One of Them. Books like that. Is it meaningful books? Is this books that trace the lives of people in different countries, in different spaces, and they rise above certain circumstances that interested you?
Yeah, this is the power of short stories in particular. I'm reflecting on the short story tradition, not only in South Africa, but on the continent. That, even though short story for a long time was thought to be a minor or an inferior genre, but you have authors like Chimamanda who keep writing short stories, and Akban, whom you've mentioned, who got fame just out of a single short story collection. So the short story for me is a future, because it's the kind of genre that allows you to read, even if in a short space of time, in one sitting, you're able to read one story and finish it. Tomorrow you can go to the next. But
yet, as you say, that a short story is not necessarily a truncated novel or a piece, that it's a genre on its own. So what does it mean to you? How have you been able to rationalize what a short story is and its importance in literature?
Well, in this book, I trace the short story tradition from oral narratives. So what I try to do is to draw parallels between oral narratives and short story writing in South Africa, which, I mean, if you think, for instance, back the drum decade of the 1950s, most of the writers there, their literary output was largely short stories. And it's a genre that really inspired me. I feature in this book, for instance, the likes of James Matthews, Njabulo Ndebele, Ken Temper, and a friend of mine, Zuki Savannah. And these are the giants on whose shoulders I stand. So to have their works in this publication is almost like having these icons over
like
a dinner
you're
table.
published alongside them.
Yeah, exactly.
And I suppose inculcating reading not only as a source of pleasure, but just also having some sort of inane sense of self and your history and your heritage, that also needs people who take you through it, who guide you through it. What has been your story as a writer and, you know, your ambitions, but even eventually coming to this PhD level?
Yeah, well, I've been writing for 18 years now, and one of the challenges that I've always faced is the fact that, one, writers don't make much living out of their work. Two, our works remain very difficult to access. So one of the endeavors that I've taken with this book, for instance, is to ensure that I own the means of production. So I produced this book under Iconic Production, which is a company that was established by my family a couple of years ago. So in that way, I'm able to distribute, to find alternative channels of distribution. So because, like, I write township stories, but in most of the townships, there are no bookstores. So what I try to do is, first of all, to use my book as my car boot as a mobile bookstore, but also try and reach to the communities that I write about the most.
So when you talk about that, contemporary South African life and literature, to your mind, how do you process it? How would you explain it to somebody? And is it as complex as some say it is?
It's quite dynamic in the sense that if, for instance, you look at the kind of writers we have today, thematically, there are vast areas that they explore. So our literature really, if you look, for instance, the number of writers that have emerged over the years, just recently, for instance, Nick Mhlongo put together a compilation, Black Text, where he had about 26 writers telling their own stories. And I believe that the time has come for us to tell our own story.
And our own story is also quite comical. I mean, South Africans are a very entertaining lot, especially even about things that are very serious. Is that reflected in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that even when you are telling a tragic story, humour lightens it up. Humour keeps you engrossed in whatever text you read. So you find that a lot in this book. Of course, there are stories that are captivating because of their emotions. But also there are stories that kind of keep you entertained, but beneath it all, there's always a strong message that's carried through.
So, trick question. I mean, I'm thinking of somebody like Chinua Achebe. He would write stories that would reflect the life of, say, a public servant. Some of it quite tragic, some of it also very comical. Is it something that you've ever considered doing what you do? I'm sure you see a lot of both. There's a lot of shade and light.
Fortunately, the creative process, there are no limits for it. So one is able of exploring any theme. That's, again, the advantage of short story writing, because, in this collection, I have 15 stories, 4 written by guest writers and 11 written by myself. So one is able to write on totally different topics, and each story has its own thematic focus. So the life of a civil servant could be one of those.
So it's mirrored in there somewhere.
Somewhere.
All right. So just a final question, or perhaps ask you to just make a statement to young readers out there, or people that you would like to encourage to read, especially contemporary African literature. What is the allure? Why should they one day become writers and contribute to this body of work?
Yeah, first of all, I wouldn't encourage anyone to dream of becoming a writer if they are not readers themselves. So reading is a prerequisite to being a writer. And secondly, I think that there's a growing culture in our communities where people, really want to read books, but the main challenge remains the fact that our books are inaccessible in the townships. So platforms like festivals, there's Abantu Book Festival, for instance, which happens in Soweto, where over 2-3 days, thousands of books are bought. So that to me shows that people are keen to access books. But also, if in South Africa we have just over 2,000 community libraries, and if each of those libraries were to buy at least 2 copies of each title that is released, it means each author would sell at least 4,000 copies. And that's a good capital base for anyone who took a risk to publish their work.
Oh, thank you very much for speaking to us and sharing with us. Red Apple Dreams is a compilation of Dr. Siphiwo Mahala's latest book. Do get a copy. It is being released this month. Now let's take you back to Steve for headlines.
Let's have a look at your headlines then this Thursday evening.